diving deep into a stack of sources about something absolutely fundamental to civilization. How the very first cities on Earth actually ran themselves.
Yeah, imagine it. Settlements that had been maybe, a few hundred or a few thousand people suddenly ballooning into these massive urban centers. Tens of thousands living shoulder to shoulder.
Right.
How do you feed them? How do you get clean water? How do you keep order? And crucially, how do you possibly coordinate building like huge projects, city walls, irrigation canals, things everyone needed?
Exactly. It's not just putting up building, it's the administrative headache. Who organizes all that? How do you make sure everyone contributes? These sources, they take us to the world's first true cities, places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, early Southeast Asia, and the Andes. And they show us the surprising, sometimes counterintuitive, and frankly, brilliant ways they invented government administration, basically from scratch.
It's like the beta version of bureaucracy, really. But instead of spreadsheets and filing cabinets, you're looking at clay tablets, maybe knotted strings, leaders who might be seen as divine, and these really elaborate ritual feasts used for managing resources and labor.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the most important nuggets from this material. We want to see the practical tools and methods these ancient administrators came up with.
Yeah, understand why they were so essential.
And figure out what they tell us about the core, ongoing challenges of organizing human society on a large scale.
And get ready for some real eye-openers. Like the idea that writing itself might have started purely for accounting.
Wow.
Or how people manage vast wealth without money. Or, and this is amazing, how you could actually run an entire kingdom using, knots.
It really is incredible. Just thinking about the sheer scale of the problem they had to solve. I mean, building a city is one thing, but making it function day to day, ensuring food distribution, settling disputes, mobilizing labor for essential tasks, that's the true administrative innovation, isn't it?
These sources really underscore that. Urban life presented totally unprecedented challenges. You suddenly have these complex needs for managing resources, food, water,
right,
coordinating huge populations for everything from farming to building, and somehow enforcing rules and maintaining order among crowds of people who weren't all, close relatives anymore.
And as one source puts it rather bluntly but accurately, early governments quickly ran into the old reality of death and taxes.
Yeah. Mobilizing labor for public works, collecting surplus food, the taxes in kind became absolutely necessary for cities to survive and grow.
No getting around it.
And the creative responses to these needs, that's what led directly to inventing these fundamental tools of governance. Things like writing systems, accounting methods, specialized bureaucratic offices, even state architecture designed specifically for admin, like storage or record-keeping rooms.
So these innovations formed a kind of blueprint for how to run an ancient state.
That's a good way to put it, a blueprint. And we're going to look at the nitty-gritty practical side, the actual methods and tools they used across these different regions.
Okay, let's start where our sources suggest the first true cities appeared, and maybe the birthplace of administration itself, Mesopotamia.
Right, Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
Often called the cradle of civilization. This is where you find the earliest big cities like Uruk, way back in the late 4th millennium BC.
Yeah.
And the need for administration is just immediately obvious there.
Why so early there?
Well, a lot of it seems driven by these complex temple estates. These weren't just, churches. They were massive economic engines, managing huge amounts of land, vast herds, organizing the labor of hundreds, maybe thousands of people.
So they needed to keep track.
Desperately. They had to track everything coming in, everything going out. It was a huge logistical challenge.
And that's where writing comes in. It wasn't for, epic poems initially.
Well, what's fascinating is, no, it doesn't look like it. According to the sources, the earliest writing system we know, proto-cuneiform, around 3300 to 3000 BC, it seems to have been invented precisely for administrative documents.
Seriously? Just for admin?
It looks that way. Scribes used reeds to press symbols into wet clay tablets. And they were logging things like grain rations, livestock counts, records of labor contributions. Each symbol often stood for a tangible item. It was all about creating permanent records for managing resources, taxes, redistribution.
So writing was basically born from accounting. That kind of flips the usual idea on its head.
It certainly seems to. Fundamentally a tool of economic control and bureaucracy from day one. And this system got sophisticated surprisingly quickly.
Yes, so.
By 2600 BC, we find tablets from a city called Lagash that actually record tax evasion. and the penalties.
Wow, tax dodgers even then.
Exactly. Some things never change, huh? And it shows not just developed revenue law, but a clear understanding by the state of the need and the challenge of actually extracting that revenue.
So who is doing all this managing? Just the top rulers.
Apparently not just them. An early list from Uruk named something like 120 different official titles.
120? Like what?
Things like leader of the city, leader of the law, leader of the plow, leader of the flocks. It points to a complex, stratified bureaucracy, really specialized jobs with delegated functions, often linked to those big temple and later royal economic centers.
Specialized jobs, just like a modern government department. Amazing.
Exactly the concept. And the scale was just immense. From the Ur III period, around 2100 BC, we found something like 120,000 administrative documents.
120,000 clay tablets.
Yeah, receipts, inventories, audits. One source calls this period basically a true empire built on accounting. Royal administration grew right alongside the temples, managing state land, collecting tribute.
Okay, but how did they verify all these transactions? Without, signatures like we have.
A key tool there was seals. Cylinder seals. Officials used these beautifully carved stone cylinders, rolled them onto the wet clay tablets or onto clay blobs used to seal jars or bundles of goods.
Like a personal stamp.
Exactly. These seal impressions acted as authoritative signatures. They verified transactions, confirmed goods were secured by the right official. The famous Standard of Ur, from around 2500 BC, it actually shows processions bringing goods tribute to the king and priests. It's a visual depiction of this managed system.
And they moved towards formal law codes too, right?
Yes. The earliest known written law codes, like Ur-Nadamu's and later the really famous Code of Hammurabi from around 1750 BC, they actually codified aspects of administration, especially taxation.
Hammurabi's code talked about taxes.
Oh, yeah. It specifies things like how much grain a farmer owed as rent or tax. And it included penalties for people trying to dodge payments. It created a clear legal framework for the state's economic activities.
How was it enforced?
Various officials, royal guys, local elders, judges, they used written orders, stamped with seals, to maintain control across the territory.
And the sheer volume of records. You mentioned an archive at Ebla.
Yeah, Ebla, around 2500 BC, had something like 20,000 tablets. It shows the incredible scope of record keeping. Diplomacy, trade, inventories, social customs, everything. And this required trained people. Scribal schools existed specifically to train administrators in that complex writing system.
So the cities themselves, the buildings, reflected this need for administration.
Absolutely. Palaces, like the one at Mari, had huge archives. Temples had dedicated rooms for storage, accounting, administration. They built large urban granaries and storehouses for the collected goods. These buildings weren't just residences or religious sites. They were the physical centers of the administrative state.
So Mesopotamia really laid the groundwork, writing for admin, specialized officials, revenue collection, meticulous records.
It's the fundamental prototypes, yeah.
Yeah.
Establishing so many administrative principles that just echo through history.
Okay, right. So if that's Mesopotamia, what about Egypt? I understand that was, well, a pretty different setup.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Egypt, unified around 3100 BC, developed a very, very highly centralized bureaucracy. Yeah. Everything structured under the authority of one figure, the pharaoh.
The divine king.
Exactly. Unlike maybe the more distributed power in early Mesopotamia with different temple estates, in Egypt, power was heavily concentrated right at the top. It flowed down from the king, who was seen as both a supreme political ruler and often a living god.
So administration as a divine command, basically top-down.
That's the core model. Authority was held by the royal family and key appointed officials. You had the vizier, who was essentially the prime minister. He oversaw practically everything: tax, farming, justice, public works, reporting directly to Pharaoh. A really clear, powerful hierarchy.
How did they handle taxes, also without money?
Similar idea, paid in kind, mostly grain, livestock, labor, various goods. But a crucial tool they developed was the cattle count.
Cattle count?
Yeah, a regular periodic census of the kingdom's wealth, focused on herds, crops. It was used to calculate the tax obligations for different provinces. By the Fourth Dynasty, it was a mandatory thing every 2 years.
A census specifically for tax purposes? That sounds incredibly modern.
It really is. An early form of state-managed data collection for revenue. And it was a direct assertion of central power. The pharaoh, or his top officials, would actually tour the country, the following of Horus, personally auditing the wealth of the provinces, not just trusting the local governors, the nomarchs.
So they checked up on them.
Definitely. And these tours also served to deliver royal justice and just physically reinforce the pharaoh's authority everywhere.
And the surplus they collected? what was it used for?
Primarily stored in these huge state granaries, then centrally redistributed. Wasn't just for the court. It was used for critical stuff like famine relief, feeding the massive workforce needed for state projects, supporting artisans, specialists.
So the state controlled the economy pretty tightly.
Very much so. The sources describe it as largely a pre-market, state-controlled system. Resources flowed up to the king, who then redistributed them based on official need, rank, status.
So the state took a lot, but it also had this clear responsibility to provide, at least for workers or in emergencies.
Exactly. And this immense administrative capacity, that's what enabled those truly colossal construction projects we associate with Egypt, like the pyramids.
Right.
The tax revenue, the grain, the goods directly finance these things, feeding and organizing thousands of workers, supplying tools, materials.
And we have actual records of this, like day-to-day stuff.
Yes, remarkably. Finds include things like papyrus logbooks, the Diary of Mirror from around 2500 BC. It's incredible. It details the daily admin of quarrying and shipping stone for the Great Pyramid, managing food for the crews, scheduling, meeting quotas.
Wow, a project manager's logbook from 4,500 years ago.
Pretty much. And inscriptions in tombs, on temple walls. They often show scribes recording harvests, counting cattle, measuring fields, all clearly for tax purposes.
So scribes were the absolute backbone here.
Essential doesn't even begin to cover it. They were trained in the complex scripts, hieroglyphs, and hieratic. They kept all the vital records. Measuring fields, inventorying stock, writing royal decrees, documenting legal cases.
High status job.
Definitely. High status. One famous text contrasts the hardships of other jobs with the privilege of the scribe, saying he is the boss. They staffed the granaries, the treasuries, the archives.
And they developed standardized tools for measurement, too.
Yeah, a clear sign of bureaucratic needs. The royal cubit was standardized for surveying fields for tax and for ensuring consistency in building projects. Standardized weights were also crucial, and most famously, the nilometer. Stone gauges along the Nile to measure the height of the annual flood.
Why measure the flood?
Because the flood level predicted the harvest. Administrators used that data to predict how good the harvest would be and then adjust tax rates accordingly. High flood, good harvest, higher taxes. Low flood, potential hardship, maybe tax relief.
Using environmental data to set tax policy thousands of years ago, that's incredibly sophisticated administration.
It really shows a deep understanding of their resource base and the need to align policy with reality. The Palermo Stone, for instance, recorded these flood levels and the details of royal tax tours. And Egypt's geography, that narrow, fertile valley, probably helps centralize control. Easy river transport for goods and communication.
What about law? Mesopotamia had law codes. Did Egypt?
But not a single comprehensive code like Hammurabi's, at least not known from the earliest periods. But legal precedent passed rulings, royal edicts, guided decisions. Local courts handled everyday disputes. The vizier and ultimately pharaoh were the supreme judges.
Okay.
And the whole system ideally was underpinned by this concept of Ma'at, divine order, truth, justice. Officials were expected to uphold Ma'at. They often boasted about it in their tomb biographies.
Did their buildings reflect this centralization?
Less obviously than Mesopotamian palaces, maybe, because royal palaces were often mud brick, which doesn't last. But the huge funerary complexes and temples, they had enormous storage facilities, admin offices, processing areas, although the sheer scale of these state projects eventually strained the system. Late Old Kingdom, you see decentralization as resources got tied up and provincial governors gained power. But the system later re-centralized, and the Middle and New Kingdoms saw the bureaucracy become even more professionalized with incredibly detailed papyrus records.
So Egypt gives us this powerful example. Highly centralized state, divine king, using detailed data like the cattle count and nilometer, relying on elite scribes, and mobilizing resources for these massive defining projects.
A masterclass in top-down control and using data for state management, absolutely.
Moving on from that top-down structure, let's head to the Indus Valley, which, based on these sources, presents a particularly, well, puzzling case.
It really is fascinating. The Indus Valley civilization, flourishing roughly 2600 to 1900 BC. They built these vast, planned cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, across a huge area. But here's the puzzle. We can't read their script.
Right, still undeciphered.
And archaeologists haven't found clear evidence of kings, like royal palaces or grand tombs, or extensive military stuff. No big armies depicted. Yet, There's undeniable evidence of sophisticated administration.
So how do you do that? How do you build huge planned cities, maintain complex infrastructure, coordinate across this vast region without obvious kings, armies, or readable records? What does the physical evidence tell us?
That's exactly the question the sources grapple with. The evidence for administration comes from the incredible uniformity and standardization across this huge area.
Uniformity how?
The cities were planned on grid layouts. They consistently used bricks fired in a standardized 1.2.4 ratio.
Always the same size bricks.
Yeah, pretty much. And they used uniform sets of cubic weights for measurement, probably for trade, maybe for taxes. This level of consistency, over hundreds of miles, over centuries, it strongly suggests some kind of powerful central authority, or at least a really effective bureaucracy coordinating planning, building, economic activity.
That kind of standardization doesn't just happen by accident. Someone or some group was setting those standards.
Exactly. And it would have made trade much easier, and any system of taxation based on goods or measures. The cities also show major municipal features, like the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, maybe ritual, maybe public. We don't know for sure. But there were also large buildings, sometimes interpreted as granaries or assembly halls.
Suggesting collection and redistribution?
Right. Hints of collecting agricultural surplus like taxation in kind. The complex at Harappa, often called a granary, has features like loading bays, work platforms. It looks designed for receiving, checking, and storing large amounts of grain.
And their sanitation systems are legendary.
Absolutely unparalleled for their time. Organized drains, wells, sophisticated sewage channels, all maintained with consistent standards across cities. It shows a high level of civic administration and a real concern for public health. Someone was enforcing building codes and managing public works on a big scale.
So even without text, the built environment itself speaks volumes about administration.
Precisely. The key tools we do find that point directly to admin are those weights, the seals, and the script itself, even if we can't read it.
Tell me about the seals.
Okay, these small, carved stone seals, usually with animal motifs and symbols, they were everywhere. They seem to be tools of regulation in the economy. Like Mesopotamian seals, they're used to mark ownership, authenticate shipments. We find clay tags with seal impressions still attached to goods, and likely authorized transactions, often found near warehouse or granary areas.
Like ancient official stamps or maybe company logos?
That's a decent analogy. They indicate a system for controlling and verifying the movement and storage of goods. And the script appears on these seals and on small tablets. While we can't read it, computational studies suggest the symbols might relate to things like taxation, trade, accounts, which reinforces the idea it was used for economic and administrative stuff.
But the million-dollar question remains, who was in charge? How did they manage this control without the usual symbols of power palaces, armies?
It's the central puzzle. The lack of obvious royal palaces, fancy tombs, or lots of military art really contrasts with Mesopotamia and Egypt, so people speculate. Maybe a more corporate style of rule. A council of elites, powerful merchants, maybe even a theocracy led by priests.
Any clues?
Well, there's that small priest-king statuette from Mohenjo-Daro, maybe a hint of a leader whose authority was religious. And the raised citadel mounds in the cities could have been seats of authority, even if not traditional palaces.
But that cultural uniformity over such a huge area and time, it still implies some kind of overarching control or widely shared standard.
It really does. It wasn't random growth. It involved deliberate planning and coordination on an enormous scale. They also had extensive long-distance trade reaching Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf. The port city of Lothal had a complex dock basin. That suggests sophisticated harbor engineering and administration regulating shipping, storage. Those seals would have been vital for collecting duties, verifying shipments in that network.
And the lack of fortifications maybe suggests internal order was maintained differently.
That's one idea. If there wasn't a constant external threat, maybe internal order relied more on social cohesion, community structures, perhaps a less visible form of policing than big armies. We lack the written archives, but the material evidence, planned cities, standardization, civic infrastructure, strongly suggests really effective, maybe less autocratic administrative control.
So the Indus Valley gives us this unique picture. Complex urban admin focused on standardization, civic services like drains and tools like seals and weights, potentially managed by elites in a less obviously hierarchical way.
It's a powerful reminder that administration can take really diverse forms. It doesn't always have to look like kings and conquests.
Okay, let's shift continents now, over to early China. Here we see a system that blends monarchy, family ties, and uses something really unique for state records. Oracle bones.
Yes, cities and states emerge a bit later in China. The Shang dynasty, around 1600 BC, this is clearly a monarchy. The king, the Wang, was the central figure, priest, military leader, ultimate judge, but the administration below him had this strong aristocratic hierarchy.
And like some other places, hierarchy was tied closely to kinship, family connections.
Very much so. The Shang court was dominated by royal relatives, allied noble families. They held hereditary offices overseeing the military, rituals, farming administration, authority out in the provinces, largely delegated to royal kinsmen or trusted allies acting as regional lords, a stratified system deeply based on lineage and loyalty.
So who you knew, or rather, who you were related to, was key to getting an admin job.
Absolutely, the bedrock of their early bureaucracy.
Yeah.
But as you said, they developed this unique administrative tool that also gives us our earliest look at Chinese writing, oracle bone divination.
Using animal bones or shells for state decisions. How did that work administratively?
The Shang kings used them constantly to consult ancestral spirits on state matters. Should we go to war? Will the harvest be good? What rituals are needed? They'd inscribe questions on animal shoulder blades or turtle shells, then heat them till they cracked. The crack patterns were interpreted as answers. These inscribed bones, they're the earliest big batch of Chinese writing we have.
And the content wasn't just, like, religious fortune-telling.
Crucially, no. While it was tied to ritual, the inscriptions are packed with administrative information. They record tribute received, what kind, how much grain or livestock, details of military conscription for campaigns, farming schedules, even forecasts and records related to building projects. These oracle bones were stored as official state archives of these divinations and the information they contained.
So the invention of writing itself was directly tied to this ritualistic but very practical governance system.
Exactly. The sources really highlight that writing had a profound effect on the state's ability to organize on a larger scale. It let them record complex hierarchies, track territories and resources, formalize tribute obligations in a way that just talking couldn't sustain for a growing state.
And later, under the Zhou dynasty, the system evolved but kept some of these features.
Yes. The Zhou, who took over from the Shang, continued a kind of federated or almost feudal administration. The king ruled the central area directly, but delegated authority to regional lords, often relatives or allies. They managed their own areas, collected tribute, provided troops for the king. It was held together by kinship ties, oaths of loyalty.
Were there more specialized administrators emerging outside the nobility?
Later Zhou texts do start listing different ministries or departments: ritual, agriculture, justice, works, war, crafts, each headed by specific officials. So the concept of a more functionally specialized bureaucracy was definitely developing, even if the jobs were still mostly held by aristocrats.
And they managed huge populations for big projects and military service.
Yes. The Shang and Zhou states could muster thousands of soldiers. They organized huge labor drafts for building city walls, palaces, royal tombs. The state's ability to do that implies systems for conscription or some kind of labor tax.
And we see this get even more detailed later.
Absolutely. Much later evidence, like those Qin dynasty bamboo slips from around the 4th century BC, shows incredibly meticulous records. Population counts, land holdings, specific labor duties required from individuals. It's the culmination of these earlier practices into a highly detailed administrative machine.
Those kin slips sound like modern census data.
They really do. Astonishing detail. This ability to track population and land suggests that systems for standardized taxation, maybe based on acreage or yield, probably started back in the late Zhou or Shang tribute systems. Law-wise, Shang was more customary, royal decisions. Later, Zhou developed written laws, sometimes inscribed on bronze vessels. Enforcement was by the king and his officials.
And it sounds like civil and military roles were often the same people.
Often, yes. Aristocrats were frequently both administrators in their regions and military commanders. Land management and military service were tightly linked obligations in that structure. They also used inscriptions on important bronze vessels to formalize things, recording royal commands, gifts, appointments, land grants. Permanent authoritative records before paper was common.
And the capital cities were clearly administrative hubs.
Definitely. Capitals like Anyang were central points. Palaces, admin halls, storage rooms, workshops making goods for the elite, likely under court supervision. The capital was the ritual center, but also the physical hub for managing the whole network.
And the Zhou introduced new ideas to justify their rule.
Yes, the big one was the mandate of heaven. This idea justified the ruler's authority based on their ability to govern justly and maintain order. It made good governance, including effective administration, a kind of moral duty for the king. They even sent out royal inspectors to check on the regional lords. They kept records of meetings, genealogies, formalizing relationships. The later Eastern Zhou period saw a move towards more centralized states, more bureaucracy, setting the stage for the Qin Empire's appointed officials.
So early China shows us administration deeply tied to ritual, kinship, using unique tools like oracle bones, and gradually moving towards more formalized, detailed bureaucratic practices.
It's a system where the ruler's spiritual legitimacy and practical ability to manage the state were really closely linked.
Okay, let's head now to early Southeast Asia. The sources here highlight a somewhat different path, effectively importing and adapting statecraft models from elsewhere.
Yes, complex societies and states developed a bit later in Southeast Asia, compared to the other regions we've discussed. You see an evolution from earlier chiefdoms, like Banqiang, toward larger states like Funan and the Mekong Delta, flourishing roughly from the 1st to the 6th centuries AD.
And a key factor here was influence from India.
Precisely. Funan and other early states there were heavily influenced by Indian models of statecraft. It's often called Indianization. They adopted Indian ideas about monarchy, law, writing systems. Rulers took Indian names, styled themselves like Indian kings, often claimed semi-divine status based on Hindu or Buddhist ideas.
So they didn't necessarily invent these tools from scratch, but plugged into existing sophisticated systems.
Exactly. Sanskrit writing, brought from India, became a key administrative tool, used in royal inscriptions at court. The earliest writing we find in Southeast Asia is often Sanskrit on stone pillars or seal rings. It signals a literate elite, a bureaucracy.
And they adopted legal systems too.
Yes. Their courts often incorporated Indian legal ideas. Some states explicitly adopted formal codes, like the laws of Manu, as the basis for their legal system. It was like transplanting a ready-made administrative technology for law and order. The king and appointed judges, often Brahmins, literate in Sanskrit and knowledgeable about Indian texts, administered this law.
Archaeology also shows planned cities and infrastructure.
Sites like Akio, likely a major port city of Funan, show planned layouts with extensive canals and roads that required organized planning, maintenance, probably coordinated by royal officers mobilizing village labor. Those canals in the Mekong Delta were vital for transport and irrigation, demanding significant coordinated effort under state direction.
And their economy, based on agriculture and trade.
Correct. Surplus rice cultivation was the foundation. But they were also right in the middle of major sea trade routes linking India and China. So the state managed collecting tribute rice, fish from its agricultural base, and it actively taxed or facilitated the international trade passing through its ports. Chinese historical records mention Funan's trade power and note embassies sent to China.
So they were administering trade routes and collecting tribute from their own territory. How is that structured?
Yeah, Chinese sources describe Funan commanding tribute from smaller states nearby. This suggests they operated kind of like a mandala polity.
Mandala polity.
Yeah, it's a model where the king's direct control is strongest at the center, and it radiates outward. You have a network of tributary chieftains, or smaller states, who acknowledge the main king's superiority, pay tribute, but largely handle their own local day-to-day admin. The central administration focused more on managing this network of vassals and controlling key economic assets like ports and irrigation.
Who formed the core admin team at the center?
Hindu priests and Brahmins often played a key role. They were the literate class, trained in Sanskrit and Indian learning. They likely handled record-keeping, drafting inscriptions, advising the ruler. Records might have been kept on perishable things like palm leaves, besides the stone inscriptions. And they used seal rings for authorization too, integrating them into those broader bureaucratic practices seen across Asia.
Big centers like Akio must have needed significant internal management.
Absolutely. A major port, trade hub, workshops, storage. It would need regulation, managing the harbor, collecting customs, keeping order, overseeing warehouses, and the scale of their rice production. With those big irrigation systems, the state likely coordinated canal building and maintenance, and probably had granaries to store surplus to fund craftsmen, the capital, trade ventures.
And this model of statecraft continued in later kingdoms.
Yes. Successor kingdoms like Chenla, and later the Great Khmer Empire at Angkor, continued using Sanskrit, and then the local Khmer language in inscriptions. They mention officials, taxes, big infrastructure projects. The massive berets, those reservoirs at Angkor, required a monumental administrative effort, building on earlier foundations. Other states in the region, Cham, Java, Sumatra, also adopted aspects of Indian admin models, like systems for tax exemptions or specialized water officials.
So, early Southeast Asia shows us how sophisticated administrative systems could be successfully adopted and adapted. It allowed emerging states to quickly build complex societies focused on farming, trade, and managing regional
It
networks.
really highlights the transferability of administrative technology and how cultural exchange can be a major driver of state formation.
Okay, finally, let's head to the Andean civilizations. These offer perhaps the most striking contrast in terms of administrative tools, building complex societies without writing as we usually think of it.
A truly remarkable case, yeah. From really early sites like Norte Chico or Corral, back in the 3rd millennium BC, through later cultures like Chavin, they built monumental architecture, coordinated labor on a massive scale, sustained trade networks over huge distances, all without a known writing system, and, notably, without the wheel or draft animals.
So, how on earth did they manage that level of complexity? What administrative structures or tools did they rely on?
They seem to have relied heavily on strong social structures,
Yeah.
particularly the kin-based community unit known as the Ailu.
The Ailu.
Yeah, essentially a local community or extended family group with shared land, shared responsibilities, shared resources. They also relied on religious authority and these really ingenious non-written methods for record keeping.
Corral, one of the oldest cities in the Americas, needed huge amounts of communal labor to build its pyramids. How was that organized without formal state records or, an army forcing people?
Evidence suggests it was organized through these pre-existing social obligations tied to the kinship groups, the Islas. It seems to be a precursor to the later Inca Mita system, a kind of reciprocal duty, a form of labor tax. It wasn't necessarily forced conscription by military, especially in the early phases. Instead, religious leaders likely played a key role, influencing labor contributions through festivals, ceremonies that reinforce community ties and obligations. Labor for these big projects was extracted as required community work, perhaps managed at the ILO level.
And you mentioned non-written record keeping. Is that where the quipu comes in?
Yes, the earliest possible evidence of a quipu was actually found at Corral, dating back to around 2500 BC. It's a knotted textile artifact that looks remarkably like the later, much more complex quipus used by the Inca Empire.
So, knots on strings for record keeping.
Exactly. It suggests they had a system for numerical accounting based on knots, to record things like harvests, maybe labor contributions, quantities of goods traded.
One source calls it an alternative form of writing, though that's debated.
Yeah, the debate continues whether quipus could encode more than just numbers and maybe some mnemonic information. But their use for sophisticated numerical accounting seems pretty clear. And it was an ideal admin technology for a society without script, portable, updatable, capable of storing lots of data. It's definitive evidence of an indigenous administrative technology developed to manage resources and labor.
And they also had complex economies, trading between different ecological zones, the coast and the highlands.
Absolutely. Administrators likely orchestrated this inter-valley trade, coordinating the exchange of, say, coastal dried fish for inland cotton or potatoes. This reciprocal economy involved collecting tribute in various goods, then redistributing them, possibly facilitated by storage facilities found at admin or ceremonial centers.
And the big ceremonial gatherings were part of this.
It looks like it. The emphasis on large ceremonial spaces, like Corral's amphitheater, suggests these weren't just religious events. They were likely politico-economic events, too, where tribute was presented, labor obligations reinforced, and maybe big feasts served as a form of redistribution or payment for that communal work. Ideological control through ritual, music, shared beliefs was a key administrative tool.
And Chavin, a major center later on, also seems to have relied heavily on religious authority.
Yes, Chavin de Huantar, flourishing around 900 BC, primarily a religious center. The sources describe it as a theocratic administration ruled by a priesthood. Their influence spread mainly through ideology, the power of their religion, not military conquest.
How did they exert that influence?
The temple complex itself seems designed to inspire awe, maybe even manipulate the senses, hidden passages, acoustics, controlling light and dark, possibly even using psychoactive substances and rituals. These were tools to establish and maintain the priesthood's authority as intermediaries with the divine.
So control through ritual and belief, not force.
Largely, yes. Chavin's administrative reach was about spreading cultural norms, religious practices, their distinctive art style, which were then adopted by local leaders in other communities. The center itself managed its own resources, temple upkeep, food supply, craft production. The uniformity of Chavin art suggests regulated artisans, and the prominent stone carvings maybe served as a permanent visual record of doctrine or important events, a different way to create lasting records without text.
So without writing, how did large-scale record-keeping work?
Heavy reliance on memorization, oral transmission, and tangible mnemonic devices like the quipu and maybe the symbolic iconography in their art. Tax or labor obligations were primarily organized at the community ILU level. Quotas for communal work, mita, were contributed to the religious center or regional power. These contributions were likely tracked on quipus, and the payment often came as these big redistributive ceremonial feasts provided by the central authority.
And the lack of a big army in these early periods.
Corral shows no evidence of warfare, suggests a remarkably peaceful early urban society. Chavin's influence spread mostly through religion and culture, not military force. Social control in these early phases seems to have relied more on shared religious belief, community accountability within the ILU, and the persuasive authority of chiefs or priest-shamans skilled in negotiation and management.
But later Andean cultures did have armies.
Yes, later cultures like the Moche and Tiwanaku did develop more visible military aspects. But interestingly, they continued to use and refine the quipu for administration. They maintained sophisticated irrigation bureaucracies relied on the Midawaya system. The Inca later just systematized all these practices on an imperial scale, using quipus for detailed census data, inventory, tax collection across their vast empire, run by appointed officials, the curacas, at different levels.
This is genuinely so different, building pyramids, running complex economies, coordinating regions without riding wheels or draft animals.
The Andean civilizations really show us the incredible power of community organization, the ILU, the effectiveness of religious authority for mobilizing labor and ensuring order, and the sheer ingenuity of developing sophisticated non-written tools like the quipu for managing administrative data. It's compelling proof that effective, large-scale administration doesn't require ink and paper or necessarily overt military force. It can be built on social structures, shared beliefs, and clever technological adaptations like a system of knots.
Okay, so looking across all these incredibly diverse early civilizations, what are the big takeaways? Did they converge on similar strategies despite the differences?
Yeah, despite the vastly different environments, tools, cultures, they all face remarkably similar core challenges once you get large numbers of people living together in cities, organizing resources, food, labor, trade, legitimizing power, and keeping order, law, ritual, enforcement, managing populations on a totally new scale. And this led to some convergent strategies, even if the specific methods were unique.
Like the fundamental need to just keep track of things, regardless of whether they had writing or not.
Precisely. A universal need to record information for administration. Their solutions differed creatively. Inventing writing systems, like in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China. Using proto-writing, like maybe the Indus script. Developing non-written knotted records, like the Andean quipu. Or importing existing scripts, like in Southeast Asia. It just shows incredible human ingenuity in finding ways to manage data.
And also the need to somehow extract surplus from the population, to fund everything.
A truly universal mechanism for supporting the state and its projects, usually in the form of grain or labor. The methods varied wildly, didn't they? Egypt's structured cattle count, China's tribute records on oracle bones, the Indus granaries and weights hinting at organized collection, the Andean Mito labor system paid back with feasts. But it was always fundamentally tied to controlling agricultural output, and tools like Egypt's nilometers show they even found ways to make tax collection more adaptive to reality.
And across the board, we see specialized administrators starting to emerge, people whose job it was to manage things.
Yes, everywhere you look. Specialized administrators, scribes, various kinds of officials, nobles managing territories, priests handling economic resources. Always some degree of hierarchy, delegation, specialization, whether it's the powerful vizier in Egypt, the leader of the plow in Mesopotamia, the idea of ministries in China, the inferred standard setters in the Indus, or the tiered Caraca system in the later Andes. Someone was needed to run the machinery of state. The balance between these roles being based on kinship versus becoming more professionalized differed, but the need was there.
Law and justice also seemed like a core function they all took on.
Seen as a key duty of rulers everywhere, yeah. Often framed as upholding divine or cosmic order. Mesopotamia developed those early written law codes. Egypt and China relied more on custom and royal decree initially, before later codifying laws. Southeast Asia adopted a whole legal system. The trend towards bureaucratizing justice courts, judges, procedures is visible across these regions.
And investing in large public works was common too. Big building projects.
Universal. Temples, Palaces, granaries, complex water systems, city walls. These weren't just construction projects, they were massive administrative undertakings. They needed dedicated officials, chief of works, chief of construction, to mobilize labor and resources on a huge scale. And these projects also helped legitimize the state, often boosted the economy.
Standardization also seems like a key marker of organized administration popping up in different places.
Absolutely. That drive to standardize weights, measures, units, really prominent in the Indus, but also seen in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, along with the widespread use of seals for authentication. Those are clear signs of administrative intent, a desire for uniformity, efficiency, verifiable transactions across the state.
And religion seems tightly woven into governance in so many cases.
Very much so. Temples often acted as major economic and admin centers, not just worship sites. Priests frequently held key admin roles. Religion often provided the ideological justification for the ruler's authority and for the state's right to take resources or labor, framing it as serving the gods or maintaining cosmic order. Chavin in the Andes is a prime example of a state built primarily on religious authority as the mechanism for control and administration.
And how they enforced their authority varied quite a bit.
Yeah, there was definitely a spectrum. Some systems, like early Indus or Corral, seem to have relied more on soft power social norms, community obligations, religious authority. Others, like the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, Shang China, or later states like New Kingdom Egypt, developed more organized military hard power to enforce control and collect tribute. But all of them created specific roles or relied on existing structures for keeping order, whether it was city guards, soldiers, or community leaders ensuring compliance. These officials, civil or military, were fundamental to stability.
So these first cities really were laboratories of governance, just as the sources describe them, experimenting.
They absolutely were. They faced these unprecedented challenges of scale and complexity, and they responded by inventing a truly diverse tool set to manage them. Clay tablets, the nilometer, cylinder seals, oracle bones, adopting law codes, developing the quipu.
And beneath all that variety of tools, they seem to converge on fundamental functions. Managing the economy, providing security, establishing justice, organizing public works, integrating people.
Their solutions were highly varied, tailored to their specific contexts, meticulous written ledgers versus, say, large-scale ritual feasting. But in every case, administrative technologies arose from concrete needs. Writing to track goods, standards for fairness, environmental data to calibrate policy, clever non-written systems for accounting when script wasn't there.
And the officials who ran these systems, often nameless to us now, were clearly just crucial to the existence and success of these early states.
Absolutely. They weren't just carrying out orders. The development of administrative capacity itself drove cultural and social development. It enabled the urban revolution, led to codified legal systems, even influenced ideas about justice and good governance as the basis for legitimate rule. The combination of archaeology from humble clay fragments to grand city plans gives us such a rich picture.
And it really does connect directly to our own world, doesn't it?
It does. As the sources point out, many of the practices they pioneered, systems of taxation, detailed record-keeping, delegating governance, establishing written law codes, have direct conceptual descendants in the institutions that structure our lives today. There's this constant thread of human organization running from those first cities right down to our modern world.
It gives you a totally different perspective. These early governments, they faced the same core problem we still wrestle with. How do you get large groups of people to live together successfully, share resources, work towards common goals? They came up with this incredible diversity of ways to solve it, sometimes through force, sometimes through shared belief, sometimes through truly ingenious practical tools like knots or clay tokens. And in that search for order, they didn't just build cities and empires, they laid the foundational practices for our own administrative world. Think about that next time you're dealing with bureaucracy, maybe filing a tax form, or seeing a major construction project underway. You're participating in a lineage of human organization that literally began with scribes counting sacks of grain in ancient Sumer or administrators knotting strings in the Andes.